Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Welcome to another episode of IIP Discussions. Inshallah, in today's video, we will be going through the question of whether Islam was spread by the sword or not. Now, what do I mean by that question first? Was Islam spread by the sword? I'm not asking, and we're not going to go through whether the lands were conquered, the Muslim empire, the Rashidun Khilafah was expanded using the sword. Obviously it was expanded using the sword. There were numerous battles in which Muslims were usually outnumbered and victorious. I'm going to go through the question of whether Islam, the religion, was spread through the sword, as in forcible conversions because the non-Muslims were afraid of the Muslims who were expanding, or whether the Muslims, put the non-Muslims to the sword and said, accept Islam or you will die, like the Christians did in Spain, where they either forced the Muslims to accept Christianity or die. So I will be going through that question, inshallah. Now, the narrative that Islam was spread by the sword is nothing new in academia. It is something that has been around for decades and now being strongly pushed forward by those of the uneducated right wing and some misguided historians who have, completely misunderstood Islamic history and the methodology that is used to study Islamic history. And they have in fact just cherry-picked things that fit their own narrative. And so let's refute some of these claims and present what actually happened during the early expansion of Islam. Now, the first and I believe the most absurd claim that some of these uneducated people make is that if Islam is a religion of peace, then why did the Muslims wage war against the Eastern Romans or the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persia? And why did they feel the need to expand the lands of the Muslims? And so from this, to draw the conclusion that Islam is therefore a religion of violence would not only be ahistorical, but just preposterous, because this conclusion has completely ignored the context of the period. The 6th and 7th centuries, they were very much part of the pre-modern world. And in that pre-modern world, there was no moral objection to expansion. It was something that was promoted. People wanted to expand their lands. If you expanded your lands, you're the powerful empire. The public, they would want you to go to war and expand your lands. And to put it into the context of what was happening at that time, not just a general context, but the context of that time, is that both the Sassanid Persians and the Byzantines, they had been fighting for centuries to gain dominance over the other. And many smaller states, they had also risen, expanded, and then declined in that period too. So to ask why did the Muslims do that, that's just absurd, because everyone else is doing it. The Muslims can do it also. Like the Christians, if the Byzantine Empire, someone could ask, why did the Byzantine Empire fight against the Sassanid Persia? Is therefore Christianity a religion of violence? To draw the conclusion that Christianity is a religion of violence from the Byzantine Empire trying to expand, that would also be absurd. And so therefore this would be absurd and just stupid to say that Islam is a religion of violence because they expanded and attacked Persia and the Byzantine Empire. Now, if we read a book called Medina to Jerusalem by Ismail Adam Patel, he goes through some of the provocative actions that the Byzantines had taken against the Muslims. Like why the Muslims went on the expedition to Tabuk. And so after that, why it shows what was happening during the expedition to Tabuk, what the Romans were doing, and so the subsequent invasions of the Byzantine Empire during the Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anhu. And this again shows why the Muslims had every right to attack the Byzantine Empire. So therefore, it is a stupid argument to ask why the Muslims expanded if they were a religion of peace. Secondly, historians from even the Orientalist circles have dismissed this absurd claim that the Muslims used force to spread Islam. If you look at Orientalists like Sir Thomas Arnold Walker in his book The Preaching of Islam, he clearly puts forward evidence to show that he's forced to admit that Islam was not spread, was not forcibly spread. He gives examples of how the Muslims showed mercy and compassion towards their non-Muslim subjects, and they did not force them to accept Islam. De Lacy O'Leary, she writes, "The legend of fanatical Muslims sweeping through the world and forcing Islam at the point of the sword upon conquered races is one of the most fantastically absurd myths that historians have ever repeated. And then there's another Orientalist, Ira M. Lapidus. He wrote in A History of Islamic Societies that European scholars believed that conversions to Islam were made at the point of the sword, and that conquered peoples were given the choice of conversion or death. It is now apparent that conversion by force, while not unknown in Muslim countries, was in fact rare. He carries on saying, Muslim conquerors ordinarily wished to dominate rather than convert, and most conversions to Islam were voluntary. This is not a Muslim speaking. These are Orientalists. And even they are forced to admit that Islam was not spread through the sword, because there is not enough evidence to suggest so. If you are looking at just purely based on evidence and what actually happened, there is no way is there enough evidence. There is barely any evidence to suggest so. So, let's look at what actually happened. What actually happened when the Muslims took lands from the Byzantines or the Persians? Let's look at the prime example, the conquest of Aqsa, of Jerusalem, Quds. No citizens were harmed, but what happened? All religions were allowed to freely worship their religion in exchange for the jizya. And during the Khilaf of Umar radiallahu anh, this was 1 gold coin, less than the zakat. It was only 1 gold coin. This is known as the Pact of Umar. So you can easily find this and you can look at this. It's the Pact of Umar radiallahu anh is famously known. Jerusalem, where the Christians did not allow Jews to come and worship. When Umar radiallahu anhu went, he allowed all religions to worship peacefully, Muslims, Jews and Christians. Then let's look at conquests like Ctesiphon, the capital of the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Persian Empire. In Arabic we call it Madain. There's a similar narrative. Citizens are not harmed. Ira M. Lapidus, let's go back to him. He speaks on the conquest and says this. The Arab conquerors, speaking about the Arab conquerors, they did not require the conversion as much as the subordination of non-Muslim peoples. At the outset, they were hostile to conversions because new Muslims diluted the economic and status advantages of the Arabs. Now, regardless of what you think, whether the Muslims, I don't agree that the Muslims were against conversion because it got rid of their status. 100% I don't agree with that. But even look at, regardless of whether this is true or not, it just shows that Islam was not spread by the sword. Because here from this argument, the Orientalist scholar here is saying that the Arabs, they did not even want others to convert. Forget forcing them to convert, they didn't even want them to convert. So therefore, these are some simple arguments to suggest how that Islam was not spread through the sword. And that is a stupid argument pushed forward by people who are uneducated, have an agenda, and are just ignorant. Wallah, these are jahil, they are ignorant people. And so I will leave you with that. And there is an entire podcast on this that I did 6-7 months ago, that was Islam spread by the sword. You can find this on our channel. And if you have any questions, please do get in touch. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.